Okay, welcome back to the Investigative Journal on this April 24th, 2015 day on our calendar. I'm your host, Greg Anthony, and you're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. You can catch my show every evening from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. FirstAmendmentRadio.com. You can also catch all the archive shows at ArcticBeacon.com, as well as selected shows on shortwave, and on several AM stations across the South. Now, today let's go back to 2010, and I want to spend some time on the strange death of Nancy Schaefer. Now, many of you probably don't know who Nancy Schaefer is, and if I even put her title, she was a state senator from Georgia, you wouldn't know either. And there's so many strange deaths when it comes to looking at the Vatican-led New World Order that you kind of get lost. Just the other day I was doing one on Hunter Thompson, and just the other day I was doing one on the many missing people that were close to the Clinton family. Now, what about Nancy Schaefer? Well, Nancy Schaefer was a state senator, and she was concerned with the abuses that were going on in child family services across the country. She started out in her home state in Georgia and wrote a scathing article, but she'd done years of research on this and was trying to get to the bottom of what was going on with the corruption in our Department of Children and Family Services across the country. How children were really being kidnapped from their parents. No better case than to look at the Tony Alamo case when you look at all of this stuff. And I tell you, I've been featuring that story, and it really gets to the heart of what really is going on, because you know what happened there. First of all, they charged the pastor of this Christian organization, which I've talked about, with violations of the Mann Act. And they'd been really going after this guy for 40 years because he preached an anti-Vatican message. And that's a no-no. You have no freedom of speech, no freedom of religion when it comes to that subject. And you have a whole network of people that are basically covering up for who I consider to be the head of the snake when you talk about the New World Order. Now, what happened then, he was charged. We've went through many shows on the bogus allegations, and I've said publicly he was framed. But the real problem, after that, what really the second approach here was to basically take away all the children. So to get the children of this ministry into custody that were involved in the church. And so over 35 children were basically kidnapped back in 2008 by the state and never to see their parents again. And then I got into the abuses that were going on, how this happened, what their parents came forward to me and said that the authorities stated that if they lied about the Pastor Alamo, they would get their children back tomorrow. If they didn't, they would go into this corrupt system of foster care, etc., etc. Now, using this Alamo case as a example, I ran across what Nancy Schaefer was doing, Senator Nancy Schaefer. She was from the 50th District of Georgia. And in 2017, she penned an article which was very good. It was called Government Racketeering, Child Protective Services, DHS Judges Involved, Children Kidnapped and Sold. And she was deeply involved in this issue. And she focused in this article on the Georgia Department of Family Services. But she said this is an epidemic across the country, and she was busy trying to first make people aware of what was going on, how the federal government was involved, and secondly, then try to do something about it to change this, because she saw that parents were basically losing their rights. And she said in this report, she focused on Georgia, However, she believed that Child Protective Services nationwide has become a corrupt organization and that the entire system is broken almost beyond repair. And she said she was convinced that parents and families should be warned of the dangers, and that's what she was trying to do. And when the federal government, through Clinton, passed a law set in motion by Clinton, it was called the Adoption and Safe Families Act. You know, they always say that when it's completely the opposite. They should call it the Kidnapping and Dangerous Families Act. Set in motion by Clinton, offered cash bonuses to states for every child they adopted out of foster care. In order to receive the adoption incentive bonuses, local child protective services need more and more children. They must have merchandise that sells, and you must have plenty of them so the buyer can choose. Some counties are known to give a $4,000 bonus for each child adopted and an additional $2,000 for a special needs child. Employees work to keep the federal dollars flowing. So you could see where how this could lead to a corrupt system, can't you? The National Center on Child Abuse Neglect in 1998 reported that 6 times as many children died in foster care than in general public, and that once removed from the official safety, these children are far more likely to suffer abuse when they're put into this program. According to California Little Hoover Commission report in 2003, 30 to 70% of children in California group homes do not belong there and should not have been removed from their homes. So what do you have? You have an epidemic. So she was trying to get to the bottom of it, right? And Nancy Schaefer, let's go back to 2010. And guess what happens? On a Friday, this was March 26th, 2010, former Senator Nancy Schaefer and her husband were found dead in their home in Habersham County. And even before an investigation could be initiated, media outlets began pronouncing that their death was a murder-suicide. So they've already decided what it was. There wasn't even an investigation. And this was similar to when you look at the Tony Alamo case, 150 media outlets were notified, and he was already convicted before he even, in the press. They had already labeled him that night as a leader of a cult, and everybody in the country already knew about it, and he didn't even get a chance to defend himself. Well, similar to here. So they've already said it's a murder-suicide without an investigation. And this murder-suicide theory, now let's be blunt. She was on to something here. She was not going to let the story go. She'd worked years on this, wanting to help people. But she crossed the wrong people, and she was a threat, so they had to get rid of her. That's a good theory. Why don't they put that one out there first? The murder-suicide theory implies that Senator Schaefer's husband shot her and then killed himself. Both Habersham County and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation began investigating the case as a murder-suicide rather than the obvious murder made to look like a suicide. Like so many people, Nancy Schaefer for 15 years the person that's writing this, it was I looked into this and had known Schaefer for 15 years, and he spoke to several people who knew them even better, and they believed that the murder-suicide theory was most unlikely for any one of these following reasons. One, it's totally against Nancy Schaefer's consistently strong commitment to the sanctity of life principles that she has fought so valiantly to uphold. Nancy and her husband Bruce had 5 children and more than a dozen grandchildren who they would not choose to leave behind so abruptly. Bruce's problem with cancer was corrected and under control, so there was no reason to end his life after he fought so hard to beat cancer. Nancy or Bruce would not likely agree to commit such an act that violates the fundamental principles of their Christian faith. Bruce was retired, and the couple did not appear to be in any type of dire financial crisis that would lead them to commit such acts. Bruce and Nancy knew that her sister, who had Alzheimer's disease, needed her to take care of her. Friends who knew the couple best state that Bruce would simply not have been capable to do this. Nancy was dedicated as a national leader to help needy people overcome abuse within the Child Protective Services organization. Nancy was actively exposing corruption within the Department of Family Services, including actions by the DFSCS director in the county where she lived. Nancy knew that she was needed in the fight against child sex slave trafficking in Atlanta, which was one of the highest activity rates in the country. Bruce was highly supportive of Nancy's work for decades and would have little or no reason to suddenly try to kill her at such a critical juncture in her career. Specifically in Georgia, Schaefer had found during the last few years that the Department of Children and Family Services housed children in foster home with a known pedophile who molested other children. She also found out in her own county that the county failed to remove 6 children from a home where they were being abused and tortured. In Georgia, she found out that 2 girls were turned over to a California father who had a pornographic video business. A report that Schaefer produced on these remarkable cases is still able to be found on the internet. Now, she was also interviewed extensively regarding this corruption in Child Protective Services, and you can still see some of her interviews. Now, in addition, Schaefer had led the opposition to House Bill 582 and Senate Bill 304, 2 bills introduced by fellow Republicans that would have likely resulted in increasing child sex slave trafficking. These bills would have been made illegal for teenagers to participate in such illicit acts. The bills effectively removed the legal authority that police now have to pick teenagers up and get them into protective custody so they can no longer be pimped for those acts. You know, Schaefer planned to be in Alabama that weekend for an Eagle Forum convention. Instead, she chose to stay in Georgia to develop new information that would have further exposed corruption in the DFCS and beyond. Now, many forum members who were close to Schaefer were aware of her courageous efforts. None of them believed that either she or her husband was involved in any type of suicide. It is particularly ironic that the Atlanta Journal-Constitution chose to quote State Senator Don Thomas in their March 26th article about Schaefer's death. It's not, we know they're bought and paid for. The Constitution portrayed him as a friend of the couple, even though he lives on the other side of the state from Schaefer's family and was diametrically opposed to many of their core beliefs. Senator Thomas, the chairman of the Health and Human Services Committee, immediately propagated and expanded the murder-suicide theory without any first-hand knowledge or evidence. That is very disturbing, considering it is his committee that should have been helping to clean up the corruption. Look, his committee's there to hide the corruption. Let's get it straight. I don't believe anything comes out of the mouth of the government. Nothing. Not one thing. Not one iota of a thing. Activists supporting Schaefer explained that he constantly advocated increased power and authority for DFCS in spite of evidence showing the organization was misusing the authority. With Nancy Schaefer no longer on the scene, the question may be raised as to how to best continue her legacy, right? I believe that she would want conservatives, progressives, libertarians, constitutionalists, anybody, as well as grassroots Democrats and Republicans throughout Georgia to unite and work to rectify this corruption and eliminate the abuses in this system, this adoption system, the child regulations on how things are done as far as in these, as far as giving money from the feds to encourage this kind of action, etc., etc. But is it going to happen? No. And why was she killed? To get her out of the way. Because she was, as they say, getting to the real problem. And some big names were going to come down if she continued. And so they make it look like a murder-suicide. And everything's forgotten. No more work gets done on it, and more children go into the sex slave trafficking around the country, as well as into these, into the corrupt hands of the Children and Family Services organizations working hand in hand with the feds all over our country. Now, when you look at in Arkansas, at the Alamo case, it's a perfect example of what's going on. If you see what's happened to these children since they were taken away in 2008, many of them, almost all of them, never getting back to see their parents again. Their lives have been turned upside down, and they're in worse shape they are now than they were in the beginning. But the main reason to overturn the Alamo ministry, or the Alamo ministry, was because of their outspokenness against the Vatican-led New World Order and what they did and what they believed the Bible was telling them. And that's a no-no, because when you believe that the Bible is the Word of God, you don't need the Vatican. And that's really what it's all about. And because they were successful, because many people were listening to them, they get over 300,000 hits a week on their website. That is why, the situation at the Alamo Ministry is the way it is. And this is another story that shows you what I'm talking about. And Nancy Schaefer, listen, it's obvious to me there's enough probable cause evidence to show that she was murdered. But how many of these things go on? You just think about all of them. When you really think back, it's amazing. I did a show the other day on false flags, on all the false flags and all the things they've done with things like OKC, 9/11, Waco, Boston bombing, etc., all the school shootings and everything, and how all of these are suspect. And then I did stories about NASA, showing you that they're corrupt to the bone, and I don't believe a word they talk about. And I don't believe we went to the moon. And I don't believe anything about their theories of what they tell us the Earth we live on is really all about. And the planetary system and all that stuff. I don't believe any of it. The other day someone sent me an article regarding the 1986 Challenger. Remember that? Remember the Challenger? Oh, yeah, everybody remembers that. In 1986, remember the Challenger went up, and then supposedly all these people were killed? Well, when you start looking at that story as well, there's solid evidence that all of these people are still alive. And when you see the evidence, supposedly they all perished in 1986, right? And many people concentrated on Judith Resnick and Sharon Krista McAuliffe and showing evidence that they're still alive, enjoying successful law university positions and careers right now. But what about the other guys? So I get sent this article that shows that all of these people are, if you look at what's going on and where they're at, they had pictures of these guys 30 years later and these women. And they're still pretty much using their own names. A couple of them have been changed a little bit. And everyone, nobody's there. Where's the media on these stories? All the money spent in investigative journalists for the New York Times and everything. When you look at these photos, it's amazing. And when you look at the evidence that some of these, small internet people, find out, I'm glad this came out, because people will find that when you start believing this, when you start seeing the real truth, you won't believe anything. It'll be easier to when you see stories that the Boston Marathon bombing was a hoax, that Sandy Hook was a hoax, and other of these stunts. When you start seeing all the evidence, you'll start believing that maybe, hey, these people are on the right track. And not all of this perhaps was orchestrated by the Vatican-led American shadow government. And yes, they would do this, just like they would kill Nancy Schaefer. In fact, this is one of their favorite chapters in their playbook. What about World Trade Center Tower 7, Building 7? What about that plane that was supposedly to go through a hole the size of an anthole into the Pentagon? It had to be a cruise missile or something else. Now, the point is, my question is, how do these fakers, like these astronauts, live with themselves? What are they told? Are they told that this is for the good of America, and they're paid well? I imagine they live a cushy life, and maybe they do it because they know they'll be killed if they talk. That could be a reason. But how did they get involved to begin with? That's a good story. But anyway, the question I ask you, when you start seeing this story, why did Nancy Schaefer really die? Why was she killed? Because of what she was doing, exposing the corruption in the DHS services across the country. Why was Tony Alamo put in jail for 175 years? Because he was exposing the large organization behind it, the Vatican-led New World Order. Why do we think that the dead Challenger crew, is it possible they're alive and well? And how could they pull off hoaxes like this? Well, when you look at this, when you look at the evidence, it's amazing, but true. And I think there's more evidence showing that invites people to assess and evaluate all these stories for themselves. And whether what I'm saying is realistically possible, go ahead and investigate it. For example, in the Challenger situation in '86, are they still alive and well? And when you start looking at the evidence, you might say, gee, there's a high probability they are. And I find it interesting because this kind of research may help us understand the mechanisms of PSYOP victim creation, as well as the astonishing arrogance that these people have, in which they've concocted and carried out all this stuff. And I think by looking into these stories that I mentioned above, and Nancy Schaefer's death, and all of them, it's a good way to really start saying, what's really going on in this country. Well, listen, we're going to take a short break. You're listening to the Investigative Journal on FirstAmendmentRadio.com, and come back in the next half hour and continue on. I've got some more information, and I want to talk about some things regarding some organizations set up to protect you, hopefully, the American citizen. Hopefully this organization's set up. Usually I find these organizations that are helping you are set up by the Jesuits anyway. But anyway, we'll look into this one. Back in 3 minutes on the Investigative Journal.
Hear it first on FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net.
Have you read the last prophecy? The book of Revelation. Who can understand it? We believe that God wrote His Word to us for our understanding and salvation, on which so many diverse Christians believe in the same fundamental principles. But not so the prophecy of Daniel and Revelation. Has God, by His Holy Spirit, given a sure interpretation to these mysterious passages through the centuries? Yes, He has. The only difference to the individual is on which side of each prophecy he stands in time, before or after, past or future. The last prophecy is as much a book of history fulfilling prophecy, exposed in such a way as to leave you without a doubt. Because we are living near the end of this era, we should be able to understand the substantial amount of the revelation which has already come to pass. Get the book, The Last Prophecy, which is an abridgment of E.B. Elliott's Jorge Apocalypticae, the most comprehensive work ever done on the Revelation, condensed down to a mere 258 pages. You will come away with numerous, incontrovertible revelations into the book of Revelation to easily dispel all of the futurist confusion which has become so popular over the last century. Visit the shopping page at FirstAmendmentRadio.com to get your copy. Get 20% off when you buy it at the FirstAmendmentRadio.com shop.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host, Melody Cedarstrom, right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free, 1-800-375-4188.
Okay, we're back on the Investigative Journal on this April 24th, 2015 day on our calendar, our last half hour this week. And let's get back to the strange death of Nancy Schaefer, that state senator from Georgia, who was, the official story, it was a murder-suicide of her and her husband. But she'd been investigating the evils of the government racketeering child protective services groups all across the country. And the DHS is the Department of Human Services all across the country in different states, judges involved, children being kidnapped, and then sold into child trafficking. She'd been working on this for years. And let's talk about a little bit of what was in her report. And I've already showed to you how this relates to the Alamo ministry and what they did to those children. But she said she was focusing on the Georgia Department of Family Services. But she witnessed that, she quoted Gestapo at work and witnessed the deceitful conditions under which children were taken in the middle of the night out of hospitals or off school buses, out of homes. And I'm going to have some stories here also relating to some people that lost their children. And it gives you an idea of really what's going on. Now, I mentioned in the last half hour that there's an organization working to help people who feel that they have not gotten a fair shake with the children and family services organizations in their state. And there are organizations set up now trying to protect people, but it's a very, very difficult thing to do. Now, what happens is they set up these parenting classes, anger management classes, counseling referrals, therapy classes, and are demanding of parents with no compensation by the system, even while they are at work or while their children are separated from them. This can take months and even years, she says, and it emotionally devastates both children and parents. Parents are victimized by the system that makes a profit for holding children longer and bonuses for not returning children. That's why she says that many of these kids that are taken into custody by the state, like those at the Alamo Ministry, have no reason to be there. Caseworkers and social workers, she says, are oftentimes guilty of fraud. They withhold evidence. Yes, they withhold evidence. They fabricate evidence, and they seek to terminate parental rights so they can make money. It's simple. However, when charges are made against them, the charges are ignored. The courts are working together with them. Now let's remember the Adoption and Safe Families Act, set in motion by Clinton, offered cash bonuses to the states for every child they adopted out of foster care. In order to receive the adoption incentive bonuses, local child protective services need more children. They must have merchandise that sells, and you must have plenty of them so that the buyer can choose. Some counties are known to give $4,000 bonuses for each child adopted, and an additional $2,000 for special needs children. Employees work to keep the federal dollars flowing, says Schaefer before she was killed. The National Center on Child Abuse and Neglect in 1998 reported that 6 times as many children died in foster care than in general public, and that once removed to the official safety, these children are far more likely to suffer abuse, including sexual molestation, than in the general population. According to the statistics she found, according to the California Little Hoover Commission report, in 2003, 30% to 70% of children in California group homes do not belong there and should not have been removed from their homes. The system cannot be trusted, she says. It does not serve the people. It obliterates families and children simply because it has the power to do so. Now, she continued on, and you can find much, much more on this subject. And how does the protective services work? Now, a New York CPS worker said this: most of the time I was taking their kids away for no good reason. All it takes to begin the potential destruction of a family is to call to one of the child protective hotlines in every state. The call can be made by anonymously, making the hotlines potent tools for harassment. More often, however, false allegations are well-meaning mistakes made by people who have taken the advice of child savers. Though state laws generally encourage or require reports if you have reasonable cause to suspect maltreatment, child savers urge us to call in our slightest suspicions about almost any parental behavior. And that sort of advice is not limited to adults. One group has published a comic book effectively telling children to turn their parents in to other grown-up friends if they get a spanking. The hotlines then forward the calls to CPS services who send workers to investigate. These workers can go to a child's school or daycare center or interrogate them without warning. Such an interrogation can undercut the bonds of trust, essentially, for healthy parent-child relationships. Could it happen to you? In 2008, this was reported. Someone said, legally kidnapped. Child Protective Services destroyed my family. Child protection is one of the biggest businesses in the country. We spend $12 billion a year on it. The money goes to tens of thousands of state employees, collateral professionals such as lawyers, court personnel, court investigators, evaluators and guardians, judges and CPS contracted vendors such as counselors, therapists, more evaluators, junk psychologists, residential facilities, foster parents, adoptive parents, MSPCC, big brothers, big sisters, etc. are alleged to, YMCA groups, service providers called vendors, hold multi-million-dollar contracts with CPS. Families are ordered to engage in services with these contracted vendors, all of whom bill medicated enormously inflated rates for services that are often inappropriate, unnecessary, and completely irrelevant to the family situation or to child maltreatment. Nothing in our life experience is more devastating than the abrupt, brutal, and unwarranted forced separation of a family by strangers. The parent-child bond is our strongest instinct, superseding everything else. So can you imagine, folks, what was going on at the Alamo Ministry and how these kids, they were just ripped away from their parents. and I've shown that it's a fraud. To have this bond severed by state agents who possess unhindered power and give no thought or consideration to the fear, anxiety, and trauma that their actions cause. It's a crime against humanity, plain and simple. This is happening to more than 5,000 children per day right here in the United States. The law states that a child can only be removed from their home as a last resort, and only when the child is at imminent risk of serious harm. But CPS services across the country do not follow this established law and policy, and nobody makes them. Federal statistics say that there are approximately 3 million reports of suspected childhood abuse and neglect each year. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services documents 900,000 as substantiated, leaving over 2 million families per year falsely accused. Now that's government records, which I don't believe. I believe there's more that are falsely accused. Of the substantiated cases, 68% do not involve child maltreatment. That's according to federal authorities. This figure is escalating at an alarming rate each year as overzealous reporting and frivolous intervention by CPS spins out of control. And again, the Alamo Ministry story is a perfect example. Go read about it, listen to my old shows. You'll see what I mean. Parenting classes required by the state in weekly psychotherapy sessions through CPS, contracted vendors, consist of nothing more than coercive persuasion designed to interrogate, break down your will, and cause you to believe the unbelievable. In the end, it's all for nothing. CPS tells you that you've been in denial. Yes, amazing. And I'll continue with this. And as I look through some of these stories, it's incredible what you read. Let me see if I can move on here. Incredible. A critical look. We can look at the child welfare system, their interrogation techniques, etc., etc. One person says, our children were not abused. They just took them because they want to close our church down. What do you think they'll do with you and your children if you don't stand up now and be counted for, as Tony and Alamo people are doing? That's what somebody from the Alamo ministry said when their kids were taken away. Now, in the United States, CPS and adoption, false allegations, and federal adoption bonuses, this is big business. In the United States, adoption is big business, bringing in more than $1.4 billion. Coercion runs rampant in infant adoption, but kidnapping is a better way to describe the tactics employed by CPS. Federal adoption bonuses have given states overwhelming incentive to remove children from safe and loving homes based on false allegations of child abuse. Low-income families are especially at risk, as they must often depend on a public defender to present their case in court. Homeschoolers, non-vaccinating parents, and others who fall outside the mainstream also make easy targets for corrupt CPS agencies all across the countries. Now, when we talked about this story and what could happen to you, let me just finish it up here and say this. It feels, more, said one parent, like Nazi Germany and the Soviet gulags every day. Think I'm being too harsh, says this parent, when he talks in comparing CPS to the Nazis? Homeschooling was a basis for child endangerment charges under Hitler. The German higher court, Hamburg, ruled in 1936 that custody rights shall be terminated for parents who, as fanatical Bible students, cannot rear their children in accordance with today's state. And because this endangers the mental well-being of the children, who are thereby prevented from participating in the national community. Behind the money is the socialist ideology that children should be raised by the state. Harvard psychiatrist Chester M. Pierce stated, Quote, every child in America entering school at the age of 5 is mentally ill because he comes to school with certain allegiances to our founding fathers, toward our elected officials, toward his parents, toward a belief in supernatural being, and toward the sovereignty of this nation as a separate entity. It's up to you as teachers to make all these sick children well by creating the international child of the future. And what is the international child of the future? Amazing stories. Now, with the implementation of that Adoption and Safe Families Act by Clinton, he tried to make himself look like a humanitarian, didn't he, who is responsible for saving the abused and neglected children. The drive of the initiative is to offer cash bonuses to states for every child they have adopted out of foster care, with the goal of doubling their adoptions by 2002 and sustaining that making it grow each and every year. Incredible. They actually call them adoption incentive bonuses to promote the adoption of children. But where do you find these children? A whole new industry was put into motion, a sweet marketing scheme that even Bill Gates would envy. The United States Department of Health and Human Services administers child protective services. To accompany the ASF Act, the President requested by executive memorandum an initiative entitled Adoption 2002 to be implemented and managed by Health and Human Services. The initiative not only gives the cash adoption bonuses to states, it also provides cash adoption subsidies to adoptive parents until the child turns 18. So, you can see how this has turned into a corrupt system, can't you? It's amazing. Let me check the time. I don't want to run out of time here. I've got about 10 minutes left, so let's go back to this. And there's a letter that was sent. And I focus on the Alamo story because it really is a perfect example of what's going on here. And here's a letter that was sent to them from New York. Dear parents of the Alamo Church, God bless you and your children. At our Alamo Christian Church in New York City, all of the many brothers and sisters here are praying for you and your children. We know without a shadow of a doubt that the Lord will make a mighty move for you and your children. Your strength and trust in God is clearly displayed when hearing the interviews and viewing the tribulations on video. As a young Christian of 2 months, your unwavering faith at your dark hour has shown me that even in a seemingly overwhelming storm, your candle still burns, providing a beacon of hope to other Christian brothers and sisters, as well as the unsaved. It shows us the great sacrifice that we as Christians must endure in these last days, and you give us comfort in knowing that you are still unmoved from such a violent and malicious attack. When hearing the interviews, one of our brothers stated, if that doesn't fire you up, then you don't have a soul. When your victory comes at the end, we are in this fight with you and are spreading the literature to the lost souls so that they may join our fight against this puppet government and the Vatican. I realize a stand needs to be made, and while you are going through your fight, I will soon be in the thick of my own, because I can see that there's no avoiding the tribulations that will surely be presented to me, same as they've been suddenly thrust upon you. Your struggle is terrible, horrible, eye-opening treatment to what forms of evil will arise to keep people blinded and to suppress the Word of God. For the misled people who have taken your children, I pray that they come to realize what the Word of God cannot be sent to jail and covered up. And that reminds me of that statement when I was looking through the Alamo court records. A DHS worker made this flippant comment in front of some of the parents because she knew they were Bible-believing Christians, and kind of laughing said, yes, God giveth, and the DHS taketh away. I will soon be in the thick of my own, says this person. The way I look at it is that God has given these lost souls, just like the one I just mentioned, precious time to figure this out, but soon their time will be up, and I just wonder what will happen. I pray that all Christian-minded people rise up and be aware of this stuff with you, and that many will awaken and prepare themselves for making a great stand. I look forward to seeing your smiling faces when you and your children are happily united. And wouldn't that be nice, folks, if we could actually see this, things have changed over the years. I don't remember when I grew up seeing so much government intervention in the families. Back when I grew up, it was more left up to the hands of the parents. But what they're doing here is similar to what I just read to you regarding how the state wants to take over control of your mind, body, and soul. Now, here's a letter to the Arkansas Democrat. Said this, and this was in 2009. Said anyone who has been exposed to the gross incompetence of the State Department of Human Services was no doubt not amused by the recent Alamo fiasco. Government agencies that want to stick their nose where it doesn't belong always make child sexual misconduct accusations. This is a universally despised act and one that causes all to rally against it. Yet in many cases the government simply uses this to condemn and violate those individuals' rights of religious freedom. Examples are the Branch Davidians of Waco, Texas, and the recent Texas group that left the state with egg on its face. If you do not fear your government, you need to wake up. The case managers at DHS investigations are incompetent and hold power that they are unqualified to hold. One case manager bragged to me that she was quitting DHS to finally get her dream job, managing a sandwich shop. Does that give you confidence in this joke organization? I hope everyone who read the transcript of the Alamo children's interviews was outraged, as I, by the leading suggestive questioning. Shame on them. Now, I've got those interviews, many of them. I'm going to read some of those to you and shows that are upcoming. I'm running out of time for that. But when you read some of these interviews, you'll see what they were really trying to use leading questions to get kids to basically falsely convict Tony Alamo, then one by one take the children from their parents, and then the final step is to take all their property. Well, they tried to fight back with a legal argument trying to get their children back, and this was filed first filed in the United States District Court in Western District of Arkansas. And since this was filed, there have been many appeals to the highest courts of the land who just rubber stamp these crazy actions by the DHS. But they ask some major questions, and answer these yourself. Do you think it's permissible to require parents of a church to leave their church housing and church employment as a condition of obtaining custody of their children when there's no apparent danger? Do you think it's permissible? Do you think it's permissible to search for and take custody of children of parents of a church simply because the parents have some sort of associations with the church? Do you think it's permissible to threaten and to take into custody newborn babies of parents of a church at the moment of birth when they're not in danger at all? And do you think it's permissible to vaccinate children in foster care over the religious objections of their parents? Do you think it's permissible to institute policies to teach children in foster care that their prior religious training was untruthful and that their parents mislead them in order to mainstream the children into views of the DHS views of the world? These are really the evidentiary disputes that came up in the Alamo ministry. But you will see that many of the children that are taken from private homes have similar disputes, although they might not be quite related to a church. But if you just remember, if you look at this case and you see the legal arguments that I've read through, if I was a defense attorney, I think we'd have a slam dunk case. But you can have a slam dunk case and be right and still not get any justice in this country regarding, oh, this issue is huge. All you got to go back is look at what the rulings were in the courts during the Third Reich, and you'll see it's primarily the same thing. But I guess we live in a free country, don't we? I guess we live in a place that was fighting Nazism. But, really, we're the same. And we back Nazism, if we want to look at the real facts. And so as we see our rights getting dwindled away, take this case and think about it over the weekend. Look it up yourselves when you're on the internet. And you'll come to the same conclusion that I did. 1, Tony Alamo was framed, these children were kidnapped, and the state is stealing their property. Plain and simple. Now, I'm going to come back next week. I've got a couple of shows I want to do on some of the testimony that these kids, it was just leading questions and really ridiculous questions by the CPS workers. But have a good weekend. Back next week on the Investigative Journal.